Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. Me and my enemy challenged the Ouija board to give us survival game who will last alive. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd willingly spend time with Sean Harrington. To say we hated each other would be an understatement. We'd been rivals since elementary school, constantly butting heads over everything. From who was the fastest runner in gym class to who could get better grades in history. By the time we hit high school, our rivalry had escalated to full-blown animosity. We ended up in the same friend group somehow though. Maybe it was one of those keep your enemies closer situations, but I think it was more because our friends found our constant bickering amusing. There was always this unspoken tension whenever we were in the same room, but we usually managed to keep it civil, if only for the sake of our mutual friends. Last Friday, we were all hanging out at Tom's place. Tom's the type of guy who's always down for some weird or offbeat fun. So it wasn't surprising when he pulled out an old Ouija board he'd found at a garage sale. It looked ancient, like something out of a cheesy horror movie. The wood was worn, the letters faded, and the planchette was chipped. Still, Tom was grinning ear to ear, practically bouncing with excitement. "Guys, we should totally play this," Tom said, holding up the board like it was some great treasure. Most of us laughed it off, figuring it was just another one of Tom's goofy ideas. But then, of course, Sean had to open his big mouth. "That's kid stuff," Sean scoffed. "It's not like it even works. Why don't we make it interesting?" I could feel everyone's eyes shift between us, the familiar tension bubbling up. I wasn't about to back down from whatever he was proposing, not in front of everyone. "And what do you suggest, Sean?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. His smile was that smug, infuriating smirk I'd come to hate over the years. "Let's ask it to give us a survival challenge. Something to really prove who's better, who's smarter, who's tougher." His eyes locked on mine. "Let's see who'll last the longest." I rolled my eyes, but inside I felt a cold pit forming in my stomach. There was something about the way he said it that didn't sit right with me, but I'd never back down from him. "Fine," I said. "Let's do it. But don't cry when you lose." Tom looked between us, a mix of excitement and uncertainty on his face. "You sure about this? I mean, we're just messing around, right?" "Totally," Sean replied, still smirking. "Unless someone's too scared." That was it, the final push. I nodded to Tom. "Set it up." The room quieted down as Tom set the board on the floor, placing the planchette in the center. We all gathered around, the rest of our friends watching with a mix of curiosity and unease. I don't know what I was expecting, but the air felt heavy, like something unseen was hanging over us. "All right," Tom said, looking at us. "So how are we doing this?" I met Sean's gaze, the challenge clear. "We'll ask it to give us a survival game, something only the winner can get out of." Sean's smile widened. "Sounds perfect." Tom swallowed, clearly not as sure about this anymore, but he played along, placing his fingers on the planchette. Sean and I followed suit. The wood was cold and smooth under my fingertips, and I could feel a slight tremor in my hand. I told myself it was just nerves. After all, we were just playing a game, but deep down, something felt wrong. Very wrong. Tom took a deep breath. "All right, here goes nothing. Spirits, if you're there, we want a challenge, a survival game. Give us something that will prove who's really the best." For a few seconds, nothing happened. I almost sighed in relief, thinking the whole thing was a bust. But then the planchette began to move. At first, it was slow, almost hesitant. Then it picked up speed, sliding across the board with a kind of urgency that sent chills down my spine. Tom's eyes widened, and I could see the same unease reflected in Sean's face, though he tried to hide it. The planchette moved to the letter S, then to top stop. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, my voice coming out more shaky than I intended. "Keep going," Sean snapped, his bravado slipping a little. The planchette moved again, this time to D. then our dare. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Tom's voice wavered as he spoke. Spirits, what kind of dare? The planchette began to move faster, spelling out the words with an almost frantic energy. Fenmetimer and Suti stared at the board, the words blurring in my mind. Find me. Time runs out. My heart pounded in my chest, a growing sense of dread wrapping itself around me like a cold, clammy hand. Tom pulled his hand back, shaking his head. Guys, I don't like this. We should stop. But Sean wouldn't let it go. Find what? What does that even mean? Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know, man, but it's freaking me out. Let's just finish this, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Spirits, what are we supposed to find? The planchette moved one last time, spelling out a final word before it shot to goodbye with such force that it nearly flew off the board. Death, death. The room fell silent, the word hanging in the air like a dark cloud. No one spoke, no one moved. We all just stared at the board, the finality of that word sinking in. My pulse raced, and I could see the same fear mirrored in everyone else's eyes. But Sean, he was grinning, as if he'd won some twisted game. Well, he said, breaking the silence, looks like we've got our challenge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just crossed a line we shouldn't have. Something about this was different. It wasn't just a game anymore. The air felt charged, like we'd woken something up, something we couldn't control. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. I guess we do. But deep down, I knew. This was only the beginning. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We tried to shake off the tension by playing video games, watching dumb movies, and just goofing around like usual. But the mood had shifted. That word, death, lingered in the back of my mind like a bad taste I couldn't get rid of. Every time I glanced at Sean, I could see that same cold determination in his eyes, as if he was still riding the high of our so-called challenge. Eventually, people started to crash on the couches and the floor, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlights outside dancing eerily across the walls. My thoughts kept drifting back to the Ouija board and those cryptic messages. Find me. Time runs out. Death. What the hell had we done? When I finally did fall asleep, it was restless and plagued with strange dreams. I saw a dark figure standing at the edge of a forest, its back turned to me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me, even though I couldn't see its face. There was something familiar about it, but every time I tried to get closer, my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck in quicksand, slowly sinking as the figure loomed closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, the only sound the soft breathing of my friends scattered around the living room. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 3:17 a.m. That witching hour nonsense that people talk about flitted through my mind, and I quickly pushed it aside. Just a stupid dream, I told myself. Nothing more. The next day, everything seemed back to normal. We grabbed breakfast at a local diner, our conversation light and easy, as if nothing had happened. Sean acted like his usual self, cracking jokes and taking jabs at me, but there was an edge to his humour, something darker lurking just beneath the surface. After we all went our separate ways, I tried to forget about the night before. I even convinced myself that the whole thing was just some weird coincidence, that the Ouija board had been a trick of the mind, some group hallucination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something we couldn't stop. The first sign that things were going wrong came that evening. I was at home, going through my usual routine, homework, dinner, then zoning out in front of the TV until it was time for bed. It was a typical, boring Sunday night. I'd almost managed to convince myself that the whole thing was just some overactive imagination, that I was getting worked up over nothing. But then, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from somewhere inside the house. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, or maybe one of the old windows rattling in the wind. But the noise was too steady, too deliberate. I paused, toothbrush still in my mouth, and listened. Tap, tap. It was slow, rhythmic, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on a table. I set the toothbrush down and followed the sound, my heart starting to beat faster with each step. The tapping led me to the front door. It was late, around 11 p.m, and my parents were already asleep. There shouldn't have been anyone outside, but the sound was clear, coming from the other side of the door. Tap, tap, tap. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something felt wrong. This wasn't just someone messing around or a stray animal. The tapping was too precise, too purposeful. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the door. There was nothing there. The street was empty, silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was gnawing at me. But then I saw it, etched into the wood of the porch, right in front of the door, were the words, "Time runs out." My blood ran cold. I knelt down, running my fingers over the letters, hoping it was just some trick of the light, but the grooves were real, the words carved deep into the wood. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was Sean, trying to mess with me. He'd always been a little too into our rivalry. Maybe this was just another one of his pranks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't him. The timing, the way the words were carved with such precision, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a warning. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside had me on edge, my mind jumping to the worst conclusions. The dream from the night before kept replaying in my head, the figure in the forest, the sense of dread that came with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected somehow, that whatever we'd stirred up with that stupid Ouija board was coming for us. The next day at school, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about the message. Sean was his usual cocky self, but there was something off about him too. His eyes kept darting around, like he was on edge, looking over his shoulder when he thought no one was watching. I wanted to confront him, to ask if he had anything to do with the message, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that he'd deny it, and I'd be left with no explanation at all. It wasn't until lunch that I realised I wasn't the only one who'd had a weird night. Tom, who usually joined us at our table, was nowhere to be seen. When I asked around, no one had seen him since the night before. It wasn't like him to skip school without telling anyone, especially not his best friend, Kyle. Kyle looked worried, and as the day went on, his concern only grew. Tom wasn't answering his phone. And when Kyle stopped by his house after school, Tom's mum said she hadn't seen him since breakfast. That's when the dread really started to sink in. It was like a domino effect, the fear spreading from one of us to the next. Something had happened to Tom, something bad, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was our fault. If the challenge we'd made with that Ouija board had set something in motion that we couldn't stop. I wanted to tell Sean, to ask him what we should do, but the words died in my throat every time I tried. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that somewhere out there, something was waiting for us. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. Time was running out. The next morning, the air in the school felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Word had spread about Tom's disappearance. Teachers were tense, whispering in the halls, and the students, well, most of them were more curious than worried, gossiping like it was some juicy bit of drama. But for those of us who'd been there that night, the fear was real. We all knew something was wrong. Something bigger than a kid just skipping school. When I saw Sean that morning, he looked like hell. Dark circles under his eyes, clothes rumpled like he hadn't slept. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by this uneasy energy that had him constantly fidgeting. I caught up to him by his locker, and for the first time in years, there was no snide remark, no smug grin, just a tired, haunted look. "Have you heard anything about Tom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sean shook his head, his gaze darting around like he was expecting something to jump out at him. "Nothing. It's like he just vanished. I hesitated, then decided to bite the bullet. Do you think it has something to do with what happened at Tom's house, with the Ouija board? Sean's eyes snapped to mine, and for a moment I saw genuine fear. But then he scowled, shaking his head. Don't be stupid. That was just a game. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were way past the point of it just being a game. Then how do you explain the message on my porch and Tom disappearing? Sean didn't answer, just slammed his locker shut with more force than necessary. Look, I don't know, all right? But sitting around freaking out isn't going to help. Tom probably just ran away or something. His words rang hollow, and we both knew it. Tom wasn't the type to just run off, especially not without telling anyone. But before I could push the issue, Sean was already walking away, leaving me standing there with a sinking feeling in my gut. The rest of the day dragged on in a blur of unanswered questions and growing unease. By the time the final bell rang, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. All I wanted was to go home, crawl into bed and forget about everything. But as I walked home, that familiar feeling of being watched crept over me again, like cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the streets were empty, eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of distant traffic and birds seemed muffled, like the world was holding its breath. When I got home, the house was dark. My parents wouldn't be back from work for another couple of hours, and normally I would have enjoyed the solitude. But today, it felt oppressive. I locked the door behind me, double-checking it before heading upstairs. My bedroom felt like a sanctuary, the only place where I could pretend everything was normal. But as I sat at my desk, trying to distract myself with homework, that tapping sound returned. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of papers. But as I listened, it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window this time, not the front door. My breath hitched, and for a moment I was frozen in place, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The rational part of my brain told me it was just a branch, maybe some loose siding. But the deeper, more primal part of me knew better. Slowly, I turned to face the window. The blinds were half closed, the setting sun casting long, shadowy stripes across the room. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I forced myself to stand, each step toward the window, feeling like it took a year. When I reached the window, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cord to lift the blinds. Every instinct screamed at me to just walk away, to leave whatever was out there alone. But I couldn't, I had to know. With a quick, sharp motion, I yanked the blinds up. Nothing. The backyard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived, because that's when I saw it, carved into the glass, just like the message on my porch, were the words, "Find me." I stumbled back, heart racing, my mind spinning. This wasn't possible. No one could have gotten to my window without me hearing, without leaving any sign. But there it was, plain as day, and there was no mistaking the message. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Sean's number. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again, but the same thing happened. Panic started to set in. I knew Sean would never admit it, but if he was seeing the same things I was, he had to be just as scared. I spent the next hour pacing my room, jumping at every little noise, checking my phone every few minutes. When Sean finally called me back, his voice was strained, like he was trying to keep it together, but barely succeeding. "I saw it too," he said without preamble. On my mirror, same words. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What the hell is going on, Sean? This isn't just a game. Something's messing with us." Sean was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, he sounded more serious than I'd ever heard him. "We need to figure this out. Find out what it is. Maybe that's what it wants. Whatever we stirred up with that stupid board." "But how? It's not like there's a guidebook on how to deal with this kind of crap." I shot back, trying to keep the panic from creeping into my voice. I don't know, Sean admitted. But we can't just sit here waiting for something else to happen. We need to be proactive. Meet me at the library tomorrow after school. We'll see if we can find anything that might help. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. I agreed, and we hung up, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the creeping dread that something was very, very wrong. That night, the dreams were worse. The dark figure was there again, but this time it was closer. I could see more of it, the way its long, shadowy fingers twitched as it beckoned me forward. The faint, hollow whisper that seemed to echo in my ears even after I woke up. And this time, when I tried to move, my feet weren't stuck. I could walk, slowly, tentatively. I took a step toward the figure, and as I did, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words exactly, more like fragmented thoughts, pieces of something ancient and dark. I woke up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. The clock read 3:17 a.m. again, the witching hour. But this time, there was something else. A noise. Soft but distinct. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from inside the house. And this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what it was. The next day, I was a wreck, running on maybe 3 hours of sleep and a stomach full of dread. I met Sean at the library as planned, and the look on his face told me he hadn't slept much either. We didn't say much as we scoured the shelves for anything that might give us a clue. Books on folklore, the supernatural, old urban legends, anything that might explain what was happening to us. But after hours of searching, we came up with nothing. Just a lot of vague warnings about messing with things you don't understand. Stories of people who disappeared after summoning something they couldn't control. It was almost worse than finding nothing at all, because it confirmed what I'd been afraid of since the beginning. We were in over our heads, and there was no easy way out. As we left the library, the sun was setting, casting long dark shadows across the street. Sean walked beside me, silent and tense, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I could tell he was scared, and that scared me more than anything else. Sean wasn't the type to show fear, not to anyone, least of all me. When we reached the corner where we usually split off to head home, Sean hesitated. "Look," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We can't keep this to ourselves. Whatever this is, it's not just about us anymore. We need to tell someone, get help." I wanted to agree with him, to just throw in the towel and let someone else deal with this nightmare. But who could we tell? Who would believe us? The police? Our parents? They'd think we were crazy. "We can't," I said finally. "Not yet. We need more proof, something that people can't just brush off as a prank or a coincidence. We need to find out what it wants." Sean didn't argue, but I could see the reluctance in his eyes. "Fine. But if something else happens, we're telling someone. Agreed?" "Agreed." We parted ways, and as I walked home, the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure from my dreams lurking in the shadows. But the street was empty. When I got home, the house was dark again, my parents out for the evening. I locked the door behind me, checking it twice before heading upstairs. My room felt colder than usual, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. I didn't want to sleep, didn't want to see that figure again, but my body was exhausted. I lay down, the events of the past few days spinning through my mind in an endless loop. And as I drifted off, I heard it again, that soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of sleep. Tap, tap, tap. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was a whisper, so faint it could have been the wind. Time runs out. The walk to the old cabin felt like a death march. The forest around us was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The sun had begun to set, casting long, twisted shadows that stretched across the path, making it difficult to tell where reality ended and the nightmare began. Sean led the way, his face set in a grim mask of determination. I followed close behind, the dread in my chest growing with each step. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. One that we'd set for ourselves the moment we touched that cursed Ouija board. When we finally reached the cabin, it was just as I remembered from our childhood adventures. Dilapidated, overgrown, and reeking of decay. The windows were broken, the door hanging off its hinges, but there was something else too. A sense of wrongness, a dark energy that seemed to pulse from the very walls. Sean didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open with a loud creak, stepping into the dark interior. I followed, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust-filled air and the rotting furniture inside. The cabin was just as we'd left it years ago, but now it felt different. Darker, more oppressive. The shadows seemed to shift and move on their own, and the temperature had dropped significantly since we'd entered, our breath visible in the icy air. Sean moved to the center of the room, his footsteps echoing ominously on the creaky floorboards. "This is where it all started," he said, his voice low. "The day we found that stupid board." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The memory of that day flashed through my mind. Two curious kids stumbling upon the old Ouija board, hidden under a floorboard, laughing as we dared each other to play with it. We'd had no idea what we were getting into. Sean turned to face me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "We have to finish this," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Whatever we unleashed, it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "And what does it want?" Sean hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know, but I think it's been leading us here, back to where it all began. Maybe it's trying to make us face it." I didn't like the sound of that, but he was right. We couldn't keep running. We had to confront whatever this was, even if it terrified me more than anything else in my life. As we stood there, the oppressive silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. The same tapping we'd both heard in our homes, only now it was louder, more insistent, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. My heart leaped into my throat, and I stepped back instinctively. Sean didn't flinch. Instead, he knelt down, running his hand over the dusty floor until he found what he was looking for. A loose board, the one we'd pried up as kids. With a grunt, Sean lifted the board, revealing the dark, gaping hole beneath. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, echoing up from the depths like a heartbeat. My phone's light barely penetrated the darkness below, but I could see something glinting faintly at the bottom of the hole. Something metallic. Sean reached in, his hand trembling slightly, and pulled out the object. When he brought it into the light, I felt my stomach turn. It was the planchette from the Ouija board, but it was different now. Warped, blackened, and covered in strange, intricate symbols that hadn't been there before. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around us, filling the cabin with a malevolent presence. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. "Time's up." The cabin shook violently, the floorboards creaking and groaning as if they were about to collapse. Sean staggered to his feet, clutching the planchette in one hand and grabbing my arm with the other. "Run!" he shouted, his voice filled with panic. We bolted for the door, the cabin shuddering around us as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The shadows on the walls writhed and twisted, reaching out for us as we sprinted across the room. I could feel them brushing against my skin, cold and clammy, leaving a trail of ice in their wake. We burst out of the cabin just as the roof caved in, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. I stumbled and fell to my knees, coughing and gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Sean collapsed beside me, clutching the planchette like it was a lifeline. For a moment, all we could do was breathe, the night air cold and sharp in our lungs. The forest around us was still unnervingly quiet, but the oppressive sense of dread had lifted slightly, as if whatever had been in that cabin was no longer there, or at least no longer interested in us. I turned to Sean, my voice barely more than a whisper. Did we Did we stop it? He looked down at the planchette in his hand, his expression unreadable. I don't know, he said quietly, but I think, whatever it was, it wanted us to bring this back here. Maybe it just wanted to be found. I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't have the energy to ask. All I knew was that we'd survived. Barely. And whatever dark force we'd unleashed, it had taken something from us that we could never get back. The innocence of childhood, the belief that we were untouchable. We'd looked into the abyss, and it had looked back. Sean stood, his legs unsteady, and tossed the planchette into the dark, gaping hole that had once been the cabin's foundation. It landed with a dull thud, the sound swallowed up by the darkness below. He turned to me, his eyes tired but resolute. "Let's get out of here," he said. I didn't argue. We walked back through the forest in silence, the oppressive atmosphere finally lifting as we neared the edge of the trees. By the time we reached the road, it was as if nothing had happened. The night was quiet, the stars shining brightly overhead, but I knew better. I could still feel the weight of what we'd done, the consequences of our actions pressing down on me. We'd played with something we didn't understand, and we'd paid the price. Tom was gone, and there was no bringing him back. As we reached the spot where our paths usually diverged, Sean hesitated. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Then, finally, he spoke. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice low. "We still have to live with what we did." I nodded, knowing he was right. Whatever happened next, we'd have to face it alone. "Take care of yourself, man," he said, turning away and heading down the road without looking back. I watched him go, the darkness swallowing him up, and then I turned toward home. The walk was long and lonely, the night air cold against my skin. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that dark figure from my dreams following me. But the road behind me was empty. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and headed straight to my room. I didn't bother turning on the lights, just collapsed onto my bed, exhausted in every possible way. And as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the past few days replayed in my mind, over and over, a never-ending loop of fear and regret. I knew I wouldn't sleep, not with the memory of those whispers echoing in my ears, but as the night dragged on, something strange happened. The whispers faded, replaced by a different sound, softer, more distant, tap, tap, tap. It was coming from somewhere far away, almost as if it was outside my room, or maybe even outside the house altogether. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't gone. Not really. It was just waiting, biding its time. And deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Whatever we'd unleashed was still out there, still searching, still waiting. And one day, it would come back. Because time never really runs out. Not when you've opened a door that should have stayed closed. I played the Ouija board on a camping trip. My family went missing. So this all happened last summer, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. I've gone over it in my head a million times, and I just can't explain what happened. I'm not even sure if I should be writing this down, but I feel like I have to. Maybe someone out there will understand what I'm going through, or maybe I just need to get it off my chest. Every year, my family does this camping trip. It's sort of a tradition, something we've done since I was a kid. We always go to the same spot, deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. It's just me, my parents, and my younger sister Emily. There's no cell service, no internet, just us, a tent, and the wild. It's supposed to be a time to disconnect, relax, and bond as a family. This year, I wasn't exactly thrilled about going. I'm 19 now, and honestly, spending a week in the middle of nowhere with my family wasn't my idea of a good time. But it's hard to say no to my mum when she gets all excited about it. Plus, it was probably going to be the last time we did this together before I moved out for college. So I went along with it. We got to the campsite early in the afternoon. The place was as beautiful as I remembered. Towering trees, a crystal clear lake, and the kind of silence you can only find when you're miles away from civilization. We set up our tent, unpacked the gear, and settled in for what I thought would be a boring but peaceful week. The first couple of days were uneventful. We did the usual stuff: hiking, fishing, roasting marshmallows over the fire. Emily and I spent a lot of time exploring the woods, looking for cool rocks or just wandering aimlessly. It was nice in a way. But then, on the third night, things started to get weird. It was after dinner, and we were all sitting around the campfire. My dad was telling one of his classic ghost stories, the kind that always ends up being more funny than scary. Emily was curled up in her sleeping bag, already half asleep, and I was poking at the fire with a stick, bored out of my mind. That's when my mum mentioned something that I wish she never had. "I brought something fun for us to do tonight," she said, smiling like she had a secret. "It's a bit silly, but I thought it could be a good laugh." She reached into her bag and pulled out a Ouija board. You know, the kind you can buy at any toy store. It was still in its box, the plastic wrapping barely off. I laughed. "Seriously, Mum? A Ouija board? You don't actually believe in that stuff, do you?" She shrugged. "I thought it would be fun. Besides, it's just a game, right?" My dad looked a little skeptical, but he went along with it. Emily, on the other hand, seemed really into the idea. She was always into creepy stuff: ghosts, horror movies, urban legends. So she jumped at the chance to try it out. We cleared a spot on the ground and set the board between us. The fire crackled nearby, casting long shadows across the trees. My mum explained how it worked, but we all knew the drill. You put your fingers on the planchette, ask some questions, and it's supposed to move on its own to spell out answers. I was still rolling my eyes at the whole thing, but I played along. What was the worst that could happen, right? We started off with the usual questions. Is anyone there? What's your name? How did you die? You know, the kind of stuff you ask just to mess around. At first, nothing happened. The planchette just sat there, unmoving, like the cheap piece of plastic it was. But then, something weird happened. It started to move. At first, I thought it was just Emily or my mum pushing it, trying to freak us out. But the way it moved was strange. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was really trying to communicate with us. The planchette slowly slid across the board, spelling out letters that didn't make much sense at first. SHADOW. We all looked at each other, a little uneasy. Emily giggled nervously, but I could tell she was spooked. My mum tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a coincidence, but I could see the unease in her eyes too. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved again, faster this time. MALICE. "What does that mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but no one had an answer. We kept asking questions, but the answers didn't make much sense. They were jumbled, strange, like someone was trying to tell us something, but couldn't quite get the words out. After a while, we decided to stop. It was late, and the whole thing was starting to feel less like a joke and more like something we shouldn't be messing with. We packed up the board, put out the fire, and headed to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that word, malice. It echoed in my mind, growing louder every time I tried to push it away. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of something outside the tent. It was a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving around just beyond the light of the dying campfire. I listened, heart pounding, but I couldn't hear anything else. Just the wind in the trees and that soft, persistent rustling. I told myself it was nothing, probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wanted to wake my parents, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I stayed quiet, lying there in the dark, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I felt a little better. The daylight made everything seem normal again, like the weirdness of the night before was just a bad dream. We had breakfast, packed our bags, and set out for another hike. trying to forget about the Ouija board and the strange messages it had spelled out. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. And then, halfway through our hike, Emily disappeared. The moment I realized Emily was gone, my stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster. 1 second, she was right behind me, joking about how I kept tripping over roots, and the next, she was just gone. At first, I didn't panic. Emily had a habit of wandering off, getting distracted by things like weird-looking mushrooms or strange patterns in the bark of trees. I figured she'd just found something interesting and had fallen behind. I turned around, expecting to see her poking at some tree stump or chasing after a butterfly, but there was nothing. Just the silent forest stretching out in all directions, as if it had swallowed her whole. "Emily?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on, stop messing around." But there was no answer. My parents were a few steps ahead, deep in conversation. Oblivious to the fact that Emily wasn't with us, I jogged back down the trail, calling her name louder this time, the sound echoing off the trees in a way that felt too hollow, too empty. "Emily, this isn't funny." My dad finally noticed I wasn't with them and turned around, frowning. "What's going on?" "Emily's gone," I said, trying to keep the edge of panic out of my voice. "She was right behind me, and now she's not." My mum's face went pale. She dropped her backpack and started scanning the area, calling Emily's name in that tone that only a mother can muster, urgent, desperate, but trying not to sound scared. My dad immediately went into problem-solving mode, retracing our steps, looking for any sign of where Emily might have gone. It didn't take long for us to realize that she hadn't just wandered off the trail. The area where she'd disappeared was quiet, undisturbed, like she'd been plucked out of existence. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was like she'd never been there at all. We spent the next hour searching, our calls for Emily growing more frantic with each passing minute. My mum was starting to cry, her voice breaking every time she called Emily's name. My dad was doing his best to keep it together, but I could see the fear in his eyes. And me? I was just numb. I didn't understand how this could be happening. One moment, she was there, and then gone. Eventually, we decided we had to go back to the campsite. We needed to regroup, figure out what to do next. Maybe she had somehow gotten ahead of us and was waiting there. Maybe she had gone back on her own, though that made no sense. Emily would never just leave without saying anything. But when we got back to the campsite, she wasn't there either. The place was exactly as we'd left it, our tent flaps open, our gear strewn around. But it felt different. The air was thicker, the shadows deeper, like the forest was closing in around us. My mum was on the verge of breaking down. My dad tried to calm her, saying that we just needed to stay calm, that we'd find Emily. But there was something in his voice, something I hadn't heard before. Doubt. We spent the rest of the day searching the woods, going in circles, calling Emily's name until our voices were hoarse. But it was like she had just vanished into thin air. No trace, no sound, nothing. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, my dad finally made the call to head back to the campsite and wait until morning. We couldn't search in the dark, he said. It would be too dangerous, and if Emily was out there, she'd need us to be strong for her. But I knew, even as he said it, that we were all thinking the same thing. Something was horribly, inexplicably wrong. That night, we didn't bother with dinner. None of us had any appetite. My mum sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her eyes red and swollen. My dad was pacing around the campsite, checking and rechecking his phone, even though there was no signal. And me, I just sat there, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. How could Emily just disappear like that? It didn't make any sense. It wasn't until much later, after my parents had finally crawled into the tent, that I remembered the Ouija board. I hadn't thought about it since the night before, but now, in the silence of the night, the memory of that strange session came flooding back. Malice. I shivered, even though the fire was still burning. It was probably nothing, just a coincidence, a dumb game that had gotten under my skin. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. The word kept echoing in my mind, overlapping with the image of Emily's face as she disappeared into the woods. I got up, grabbing the flashlight, and made my way to where my mum had stashed the Ouija board. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I was hoping to find some kind of answer, or maybe I was just desperate to do something, anything, to feel like I had some control over the situation. I set the board on the ground, my hands trembling as I placed the planchette in the centre. The firelight flickered over the letters, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. I hesitated, feeling stupid for even considering this, but then I placed my fingers on the planchette. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Are you here?" The planchette didn't move. Of course, it didn't move. This was just a piece of cardboard, a cheap toy designed to give people a thrill. But then, just as I was about to pull my hand away, it slid to the letter Y. I froze. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe I had moved it without realizing it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I took a deep breath and asked another question. "Where are you?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest was dead silent. The only sound, the crackling of the fire. But then, slowly, the planchette began to move again. It spelled out a single word, LOST. A chill ran down my spine. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to stop, to throw the board into the fire and forget about it, but I couldn't. I had to keep going. "What happened to you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The planchette moved faster this time, as if whatever was communicating with me was growing impatient. "THEYTOOKME. Who?" I asked, almost afraid of the answer. The planchette moved once more, spelling out a word that made my blood run cold. SHADOW. That was enough. I ripped my hands away from the board, stumbling back as if I'd been burned. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think that this was anything more than a sick joke my mind was playing on me. But deep down, I knew there was something else going on, something beyond my understanding. I sat there, staring at the Ouija board, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could process it, I heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but it was there. A soft, whispering sound coming from the trees. My heart raced as I strained to hear it. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't just one voice. It was several, overlapping, like a chorus of whispers just beyond the edge of the light. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a sense of urgency in them, a warning that sent shivers down my spine. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The forest was silent again, too silent. I felt a cold wind pass through the campsite, and for a moment the fire flickered and nearly went out. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, before I finally forced myself to move. I shoved the Ouija board back into the box, hiding it deep in my backpack, as if that could somehow make everything go back to normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Emily was gone, and I had a sinking feeling that she wasn't the only one. I crawled into the tent, trying not to wake my parents, and lay there, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the word shadow burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but when it did, the daylight didn't bring any comfort. If anything, it only made the horror of what had happened more real. Emily was still missing, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. When the sun finally rose the next morning, it cast an eerie, pale light over the campsite, making everything feel colder, more hollow, the kind of light that makes shadows seem longer, more menacing. My parents woke up early, but they looked like they hadn't slept at all. None of us had. The first thing we did was spread out to search again, even though I already knew it wouldn't matter. Emily wasn't just lost in the woods. She was gone in a way that didn't make any sense, a way that no amount of searching could fix. But I couldn't bring myself to say that out loud, and neither could my parents. We all just went through the motions, trying to convince ourselves that this was just a normal situation, that we would find her eventually if we just kept looking. But the forest felt different today. It was quieter, like the very air was holding its breath. The trees that had seemed so inviting just days ago now loomed over us, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. We spent hours combing the area around the campsite, calling Emily's name until our voices were hoarse. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more I started to notice something strange. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent, waiting for something to happen. It was around midday when we came across the first sign that something was very, very wrong. We were about a mile from the campsite, in a part of the forest we hadn't explored before. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted and gnarled with thick roots that snaked across the ground like veins. As we pushed through the underbrush, my dad suddenly stopped, his face pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just more trees, more shadows. But then I saw it, a dark shape, just barely visible between the trunks. It was tall and thin, almost human in shape, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. It was like a shadow that had somehow come to life, standing there, motionless, as if it was waiting for us. I took a step forward, squinting to get a better look, but as soon as I did, the shape seemed to melt away, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. My dad nodded, his eyes wide with fear. My mum didn't say anything, but I could see her hands trembling as she clutched her jacket tighter around her. We didn't speak much after that. We just kept searching, but the mood had shifted. The forest no longer felt like a place where Emily could be found. It felt like a trap, like we were being watched, hunted by something we couldn't see. By late afternoon, we were exhausted, and no closer to finding Emily than we had been that morning. My mum was on the verge of tears, and my dad was barely holding it together. We were about to head back to the campsite when we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a small clearing, hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by trees so thick that the sunlight barely filtered through. In the center of the clearing was a large flat rock, and on that rock, something had been carved, crude, jagged letters that looked like they had been scratched into the stone with something sharp. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest, and traced the letters with my fingers. They spelled out a single word: shadow. I jerked my hand back as if I'd been burned, the memory of the Ouija board flashing in my mind. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Someone, or something, was toying with us, leading us deeper into the woods, showing us that it was always one step ahead. My dad was staring at the rock, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right. We need to leave." But as we turned to go, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. Movement in the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same shape I'd seen earlier, that dark, shadowy figure, only this time it was closer, much closer. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the figure moved again, slipping between the trees with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. It didn't walk so much as glide, like a shadow cast by something unseen, and then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. My mum grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Now!" We didn't argue. We turned and ran, not caring about the path, not caring about anything except putting as much distance as possible between us and that clearing. The forest seemed to close in around us as we ran, the trees pressing closer together, the shadows growing longer, deeper, until it felt like we were being swallowed by the very earth. When we finally stumbled back into the campsite, out of breath and terrified, it was nearly dusk. The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the trees. But it did nothing to warm the icy fear that gripped my heart. We collapsed by the fire, too exhausted to speak, too afraid to acknowledge what we had seen. My dad threw more wood onto the flames, as if the fire could somehow keep the darkness at bay, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken Emily, it wasn't something we could fight with fire or reason. As the night closed in around us, my mum started to pray. She wasn't particularly religious, but in that moment, it was all she had left. My dad just sat there, staring into the flames, his face hollow, defeated. And me? I couldn't stop thinking about the word on the rock, the word that had followed us from the Ouija board into the depths of the forest. Shadow. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We just sat by the fire, huddled together, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the whispers. The same whispers I had heard the night before, only now they were louder, closer, as if they were all around us. And then, just before dawn, I heard something else, a soft, faint sound that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, high-pitched and trembling, barely more than a whisper. Help me. It was Emily's voice. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. Did you hear that? I asked, but my parents just stared at me, their eyes wide with fear. Help me! The voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. I didn't think. I just ran toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I plunged into the trees. I could hear my parents shouting after me, but their voices were drowned out by the pounding of my heart, the rush of blood in my ears. Emily! I called, my voice breaking. Where are you? Help me, the voice repeated, closer now. So close I could almost reach out and touch it. I pushed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, my skin. The forest was a blur around me, shadows twisting and writhing like living things. And then, suddenly, I broke through into another clearing, this one smaller, more enclosed. And there, standing in the center of the clearing, was Emily. But something was wrong. She was standing perfectly still, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to something. Her clothes were dirty, torn, and her hair hung limply around her face. But it wasn't just her appearance that made my heart stop. It was the way she stood, so rigid, so unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Emily? I whispered, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. She didn't even move. It was as if she hadn't heard me at all. I took a step closer, my hands trembling. Emily, it's me. It's your brother. We've been looking for you. Still, she didn't move. And then, as I reached out to touch her shoulder, she slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were empty, hollow, like black voids that seemed to suck in the light. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide, too forced, as if someone had carved it into her face. And then she spoke, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was cold, hollow, and full of malice. You shouldn't have come here. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't Emily. This couldn't be Emily. But before I could react, before I could even think, the shadows around her began to shift, to move, forming into shapes that shouldn't have been possible, shapes that made my mind scream in terror. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, not daring to look back, not daring to think about what I'd just seen. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees clawing at my clothes, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening roar in my ears. When I finally burst out of the trees and into the campsite, I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. My parents were already on their feet, their faces pale with fear. What happened? My dad demanded, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, what I'd heard. All I knew was that we had to leave. Now! We have to go! I managed to choke out. We have to get out of here right now. They didn't argue. We grabbed what little we could carry, abandoning most of our gear, and started running back down the trail, back towards civilization, back towards safety. But as we fled, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever had taken Emily, whatever had spoken to me in that clearing, wasn't done with us yet. And as the sun began to rise, casting long, eerie shadows over the forest, I knew, deep down, that we were being followed. We ran like our lives depended on it, because deep down, we knew they did. The trail was uneven, treacherous, with roots and rocks jutting out of the ground, but we didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that place, putting as much distance between us and whatever had taken Emily. My mum was barely holding it together, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and my dad was practically dragging her along, his face set in grim determination. The woods around us seemed to blur as we raced down the path, the trees a dark, oppressive wall on either side. But the worst part was the silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching us flee. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps pounding against the earth, our panicked breathing, and that terrible, echoing silence. We must have been running for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only minutes. The trail twisted and turned, disorienting us further, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going in circles, that the forest was leading us deeper into its heart, trapping us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything chasing us, but there was nothing, just the dark, impenetrable forest stretching out behind us like an endless void. Then, just when I thought my legs were going to give out, we stumbled upon something that stopped us in our tracks. The path ahead of us was blocked by a massive tree that had fallen across the trail, its roots ripped from the ground like a gaping wound in the earth. The tree was ancient, its bark rough and twisted, and there was no way around it. My dad cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around, looking for another way, but there was none. The forest on either side of the trail was too dense, too tangled with underbrush to make any progress. "We have to climb over it," he said, his voice tight with fear. "There's no other choice." I nodded, trying to push down the rising panic in my chest. My mum was shaking her head, her eyes wide with terror. But there was no time to argue. We had to move, and fast. I scrambled up the side of the fallen tree, the rough bark scraping against my palms as I hauled myself over the top. My dad was right behind me, practically lifting my mum up and over the trunk. But as soon as I dropped down on the other side, I felt it. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like something was waiting for us. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest ahead was darker, the trees closer together, their branches twisting overhead like a canopy of bones. It was as if we had crossed some invisible line, stepping into a place where the rules of the natural world no longer applied. My dad landed beside me, breathing hard, and reached out to help my mum down. But before he could, we heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rise up from the ground itself, a growl, deep and menacing, that made my blood run cold. We all turned toward the source of the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. And there, standing at the edge of the trail, was something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, taller than any man, its body twisted and malformed, like a shadow given form. Its skin, or whatever covered it, was dark, almost black, with a texture that reminded me of rotting wood. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in clawed hands that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. But it was its face that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. It had no eyes, just empty sockets where they should have been, and its mouth was a jagged slash that stretched too wide, filled with sharp, crooked teeth. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at us with those empty sockets, as if it were deciding what to do with us. My dad pulled my mum down from the tree, his hands trembling. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, sprinting down the trail as fast as we could. The creature didn't follow us right away. It just stood there, watching, its head cocked to the side like a curious animal. But as soon as we moved, it let out another growl, louder this time, more aggressive. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. Hear the sound of its claws scraping against the ground as it began to follow us. The trees seemed to close in even tighter, the branches tearing at our clothes, our skin as we ran. My mum was crying, her sobs choking in her throat, but she kept moving, kept running, driven by sheer terror. The trail ahead of us seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the forest was alive, shifting, trying to keep us from escaping. Every step we took felt like we were being drawn deeper into a labyrinth of darkness. And then, just as I thought we couldn't go any further, we burst out of the trees and into a clearing. It was sudden, almost jarring, like we had stepped out of one world and into another. The sky above was dark, filled with heavy clouds that seemed to press down on us, but there was no sign of the creature. We didn't stop running until we reached the center of the clearing, where we collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. My dad was the first to speak, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." But as we tried to stand, we realized something horrifying. The clearing wasn't empty. All around us, barely visible in the dim light, were dozens of small makeshift graves. The earth was disturbed, fresh dirt piled up in uneven mounds, as if something or someone had been buried there recently. And at the center of each grave was a small wooden marker, carved with crude symbols that I didn't recognize. My mum let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the sight. My dad just stared, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But no one had an answer. We just stood there, surrounded by those graves, the silence pressing in on us like a physical weight. And then, from the trees, we heard it again, the growl, low and menacing, echoing through the clearing. It was closer now, much closer. My dad grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "We have to go, now!" But as we turned to flee, the ground beneath us suddenly shifted, as if something was moving beneath the surface. I stumbled, nearly falling, as the earth trembled beneath my feet. And then, one by one, the graves began to open. The earth cracked and split, dirt spilling out in all directions as something clawed its way to the surface. I couldn't see what was coming out, couldn't bring myself to look, but I could hear it. Hear the sound of bones scraping against wood, of nails tearing through dirt. We backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The trees around the clearing were too dense, too dark, and the trail we had come from was blocked by the creature, its silhouette now visible at the edge of the clearing. It was like a nightmare, like we had stumbled into some twisted, hellish place where the rules of the world no longer applied. And as the first of the graves fully opened, revealing a hand, skeletal, decayed, reaching out from the dirt, I realized there was no escape. My mum screamed, a sound that cut through the night like a knife, but it was drowned out by the cacophony of noises coming from the graves. Growls, moans, the sound of earth shifting, of something unnatural clawing its way out. We were trapped. My dad grabbed a branch from the ground, holding it like a weapon, but we both knew it was useless. There was no fighting this, no way to survive. We had crossed into a place we were never meant to be, and now it was claiming us. The creature at the edge of the clearing let out a roar, a sound so loud and terrifying that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The graves continued to open, more hands, more decayed bodies emerging from the earth, their hollow eyes fixed on us. And then, just as it seemed like all hope was lost, I felt something, a tug, deep inside me, like a rope, pulling me in a direction I couldn't see. It wasn't a physical pull, but something deeper, something instinctual. "Follow me," I shouted, barely recognizing my own voice. My parents didn't question it. We ran, not toward the trail, not toward the forest, but straight into the darkness at the edge of the clearing, the place where the shadows were deepest, where the trees seemed to fold in on themselves, creating a tunnel of blackness. We plunged into the darkness, the world around us disappearing as we ran. The sounds of the clearing faded, replaced by the pounding of our footsteps, the ragged gasps of our breath. I didn't know where we were going, didn't know if we were running towards safety or deeper into danger, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from that place. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The darkness was so complete, so absolute, that I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. But I kept running, kept following that pull, that instinct, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A faint light, barely more than a glimmer, at the end of the tunnel. We ran toward the light, our bodies aching, our lungs burning. And as we emerged from the tunnel, we stumbled out into the open air. We were back on the trail, the same trail we had started on, but something was different. The air was cooler, fresher, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us was gone. The forest around us was still, the trees no longer looming, the shadows no longer menacing. We had made it out. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. My mum was crying, tears streaming down her face, and my dad just sat there, staring at the sky, his face blank, his mind trying to process what had just happened. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark sky, a new fear began to creep over me, a fear that this wasn't over, that we had escaped, but not really, that whatever was in that forest, whatever had taken Emily, was still out there, waiting, watching. And as the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a pale light over the trail, I knew, deep down, that we could never truly escape it. Because some things, once they find you, never let you go. We didn't stop moving until the sun was fully up, the first light of morning filtering through the trees. By then, we were exhausted, barely able to keep going, but the fear that had driven us through the night was still gnawing at our heels. We hadn't spoken much since we escaped the clearing. There wasn't much to say. What could we say? None of us understood what had happened, and we were too scared to even try. The forest was different in the daylight, less threatening, but the sense of unease never left. It was as if we were walking through a place that didn't belong to us, a place where we were unwelcome intruders. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch made us jump. Our nerves stretched to the breaking point. We were desperate to get out, to find the way back to civilization, but no matter how long we walked, the trail never seemed to end. It was as if the forest was deliberately leading us in circles, keeping us trapped within its boundaries. My dad kept checking his compass, but it spun uselessly in his hand, the needle jerking back and forth like it had lost all sense of direction. My mum was pale, her eyes hollow, like she was barely holding on. She kept muttering under her breath, prayers mixed with fragmented sentences, as if she was trying to make sense of the senseless. My dad tried to keep us moving, tried to keep us focused, but I could see the cracks forming in him too. He was scared. Scared in a way I had never seen before. I was just numb. I kept thinking about Emily, about the twisted version of her I had seen in the clearing, about the things that had crawled out of the graves. The image was burned into my mind, a nightmare I couldn't escape, even with my eyes wide open. As we trudged forward, the forest began to change again. The trees grew sparser, the underbrush thinner, and the ground started to slope upward. We were climbing now, the trail becoming steeper, the air growing colder. The light was fading too, though it was still morning. Thick clouds had rolled in, blocking out the sun, casting everything in a grey, lifeless hue. We crested a small hill and found ourselves standing at the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast expanse of forest below. The view should have been beautiful, but all I felt was dread. The trees stretched out like a dark, endless sea, and in the distance, I could see something rising out of the mist. A massive, jagged peak, its slopes covered in shadow. It looked like the end of the world. "This isn't right," my dad said, his voice cracking. "We should have found the road by now." He was right, we should have, but we hadn't. And the longer we stood there, the more I realized that we never would. The forest wasn't going to let us go. It was toying with us, leading us deeper into its heart, where no one could ever find us. "We need to go back," my mum said, her voice trembling. "We need to find another way." But there was no other way. The path ahead was the only path we had, and turning back would only bring us closer to whatever horrors were still lurking in the shadows. I stepped closer to the edge of the cliff, peering down at the forest below. That's when I saw it. Something moving through the trees far below, a dark shape that slithered between the trunks, too large to be an animal, too fast to be human. It was heading toward the base of the peak, disappearing into the mist that clung to the slopes. I felt a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. Whatever that thing was, it was leading us, drawing us toward the peak, and I knew, deep down, that if we followed it, we'd never come back. But before I could say anything, I heard a sound, a low, distant hum, barely audible over the wind. It was coming from behind us, from the direction we had just come, growing louder, more insistent. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, a sound that I recognized all too well. The whispers, they were back, rising up from the trees, carried on the wind, surrounding us. The same whispers I had heard the night before, the same voices that had haunted our every step. But now they were louder, more frenzied, as if they were angry that we had escaped them. "We have to keep moving," my dad said, his voice tight with fear. "We can't stay here." We turned away from the cliff, back to the trail, but the whispers were all around us now, echoing through the trees, growing louder with every step we took. I tried to block them out, tried to focus on the path ahead, but the words were worming their way into my mind, filling my head with terrible images. Emily's twisted smile, the creature's hollow eyes, the graves opening in the darkness. We were running again, though it felt more like fleeing. The trail wound down the hill, taking us back into the dense forest, but the whispers followed us, relentless. The trees pressed in on us, their branches clawing at our clothes, and I could feel the cold, icy presence of something just out of sight, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. And then, just when I thought the whispers would drive me mad, we stumbled upon something that made us all stop in our tracks. It was a cabin. It sat in a small clearing, its weathered walls covered in moss, the windows dark and empty. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades, but there was something about it that felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this place, like it had been dropped here from somewhere else, somewhere far worse. My dad hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied the cabin. "We need to keep going," he said, but his voice was shaky, uncertain. "We can't," my mum whispered, clutching his arm. "We need to rest, just for a little while." She was right. We were all exhausted, physically and mentally. We needed to stop, to regroup, to figure out what to do next. But the thought of going inside that cabin, of stepping into the dark, empty space, filled me with a deep, primal fear. Still, the whispers were getting louder, more insistent, and we had no choice. We couldn't stay out here, not with whatever was following us so close behind. So, reluctantly, we approached the cabin, my dad leading the way, his hand gripping a large branch like a club. The door was unlocked, creaking loudly as it swung open. The interior was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. My dad stepped inside first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing a small, single-room space with a few pieces of broken furniture scattered around. There was a fireplace at one end of the room, filled with old ashes, and a rickety table in the center, its surface covered in dust. But what caught my attention was the wall opposite the door. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. They looked old, ancient, like they had been there long before the cabin was built. "What is this place?" my mum whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," my dad replied, his eyes scanning the symbols. "But we're not staying here any longer than we have to." We moved inside, closing the door behind us, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on us from all sides. My dad checked the windows, making sure they were secure, while my mum and I huddled by the fireplace, trying to get warm. But as we sat there, the whispers outside grew louder, more frenzied. like a storm building on the horizon. And then, something happened that made my blood turn to ice. The symbols on the wall began to glow. It was faint at first, a soft, pulsating light that seemed to come from within the wood itself. But as the whispers reached a fever pitch, the light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows across the room. We all stared in horror as the symbols began to shift, the lines twisting and writhing as if they were alive, forming new patterns that were impossible to understand. My dad backed away, his face pale, and I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt in my own. "We have to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Now!" But before we could move, the door to the cabin slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air growing so cold that our breath fogged in front of us. And then, from the center of the room, a figure began to materialize. It was a shadow at first, just a dark shape that seemed to rise up from the floor, but it quickly took on a more solid form. It was tall and thin, its body twisted and warped, like something that had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. Its eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to draw in all the light in the room, and its mouth was a jagged, gaping hole that stretched across its face. The creature from the forest had found us. My mum screamed, clutching me as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was too small, too confined, and the creature was blocking the only exit. My dad raised his makeshift weapon, but it was useless. We all knew it was useless. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring our fear. The light from the symbols on the wall flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the floor. The whispers had stopped now, replaced by a deep, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. I could feel the cold radiating from the creature, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my skin, my bones, freezing me in place. My mind was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something, but my body refused to move. And then, just as the creature reached out toward us, everything stopped. The cabin fell silent, the glowing symbols dimmed, and the creature froze, its hand outstretched, its empty eyes locked on mine. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it was over, that we were about to be consumed by the darkness that had been stalking us. But then, from somewhere deep within the creature, I heard a sound. It was faint, almost drowned out by the silence, but it was there. A small, pitiful whimper. I realized then what I was hearing. It was Emily's voice. The creature's form wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind, and I could see something shifting within it, something struggling to break free. The cabin seemed to shake, the walls groaning as the light from the symbols began to pulse again, brighter and brighter, until it was blinding. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end, but instead of cold, I felt warmth, an intense, burning heat that spread through the room, pushing back the darkness. The creature let out a shriek, a horrible, ear-splitting sound that seemed to tear through reality itself. And then, with a final flash of light, it was gone. The cabin was dark and silent once more. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden darkness, and saw that the creature had vanished, leaving behind only the faint, glowing symbols on the wall. My parents were beside me, both of them trembling, their faces pale with shock. We were alive. Somehow, we had survived, but as the adrenaline began to wear off, I realized that something was wrong. The cabin felt different, as if it had been stripped of all life, all warmth. The air was still, too still, and the faint light from the symbols had faded completely. And then, I saw her. Emily. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She looked exactly as she had the last time I saw her, before she disappeared into the woods, before all of this madness had begun. "Emily," I whispered, barely daring to believe it. She didn't respond, just stared at us, her eyes filling with tears. My mum let out a sob, rushing forward to embrace her, but as soon as she touched her, Emily collapsed, falling to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. We rushed to her side, but it was too late. Her body was cold, lifeless, as if whatever had brought her back had only done so for a fleeting moment. My mum cradled her in her arms, rocking back and forth, her cries filling the cabin. My dad just sat there, his face blank, his mind unable to process what had just happened. I could only stare at the symbols on the wall, the marks that had brought us to this place, that had opened the door to whatever horror had taken Emily from us. They were dark now, lifeless, but I knew they would never leave me. As we sat there in that cold, empty cabin, I realised the truth. We had escaped the forest, but we hadn't truly escaped. Whatever had found us, whatever had taken Emily, was still with us, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as we finally gathered the strength to leave the cabin, to carry Emily's body back to the trail, back to a world that would never understand what we had been through, I knew one thing for certain. Some places are meant to be left alone. Some doors should never be opened. Because once you invite the darkness in, it never truly leaves, and it will always come back for you.